By the mid-1960s, the war unleashed in Vietnam against communism was yielding devastating results for both sides. The strategy adopted by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, under the leadership of General William Westmoreland between 1964 and 1968, focused on a simple yet brutal premise: to kill more. The tactic of accumulating enemy casualties as a measure of success in the war was based on the belief that by significantly weakening the adversary, their fighting capacity would erode, ensuring victory. However, in the case of the Vietnam War, this tactic proved ineffective for several reasons. Firstly, the conflict was not limited to a conventional military confrontation, but also involved a complex political and social framework. Secondly, the Viet Cong guerrillas and the North Vietnamese Army enjoyed widespread popular support in many areas of the South, making it difficult to eradicate communism through military force alone. The guerrilla response to the tactic of accumulating casualties was nothing short of a relentless wave of deadly traps and ambushes. These tactics, employed by both the Viet Cong guerrillas and American forces, unleashed a brutal and merciless struggle in the jungle. Are you ready to delve into this tale of terror and bravery? Every trail could become a deadly trap, with booby traps, landmines, or napalm bombs waiting to detonate right before your eyes. Join us in the next military history video where we will unveil the most ferocious ambush tactics that made the Vietnam War one of the bloodiest in history. Let's go into the Vietnamese jungle. The enemy that the Americans encountered was formidable. The Viet Cong, formerly known as the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, emerged as a powerful communist guerrilla force during the war. Composed primarily of insurgents from the South, they confronted the US-backed government in their struggle to unify the country under a communist regime. Employing meticulously orchestrated guerrilla tactics, the group challenged established military conventions and exploited the dense jungle terrain to launch devastating surprise attacks. Traps became an essential tool of their strategy, serving both as physical and psychological weapons. Punji stakes, simple in design yet deadly effective, consisted of sharpened bamboo sticks concealed under dense vegetation, often poisoned to ensure severe infections for those who fell into them. More elaborate board traps leveraged foot pressure on wood to trigger mechanisms that launched stakes or nails towards unsuspecting soldiers. Everything could conceal a grenade or an anti-personnel mine. Even bridges designed to collapse under the weight of those crossing hid punji stakes in their depths, ready to injure uniformed personnel falling into the water. Additionally, side-closing traps, ingenious in their conception, ensnared soldiers' legs between nail-filled boards, causing debilitating wounds and sowing chaos among enemy ranks. Each deception, however rudimentary it may seem, testified to the Viet Cong's deep knowledge of their environment and their ability to adapt to it. This skill to turn natural resources into lethal weapons not only compensated for the guerrilla group's disadvantage in weaponry and technology, but also played a crucial role in their resistance against the world's most powerful military force. Moreover, the insurgents deployed an invisible terror that deeply affected the minds of American soldiers, surpassing the mere physical threat they posed. This constant fear of the unknown, of making a misstep and triggering a deadly trap, generated a state of paranoia that permeated every jungle patrol. Soldiers moved with extreme caution, aware that the ground beneath their feet could transform into their worst enemy at any moment. The troops' psyche was severely impacted, as the anticipation of omnipresent yet invisible danger undermined morale and weakened combat effectiveness. During the first phase of the conflict in Vietnam, known as the War of Attrition, the search and destroy tactic became the modus operandi. This maneuver involved locating enemy units in the dense jungle, engaging them in combat, bombing them, and then returning to secure zones. It turned out to be a true ordeal, as locating and exterminating the enemy on their own turf was extremely challenging. Despite expecting a quick and decisive victory, the conflict became a nightmare for the American youth, engaged in an increasingly difficult and questionable endeavor. The search and destroy operations not only faced relentless resistance, but also caused physical and emotional strain on the soldiers involved. The impenetrable jungle, hostile climate, and guerrilla tactics further complicated the situation, turning each maneuver into a test of endurance and determination. As the war dragged on and American casualties mounted, questions arose about the effectiveness and morality of the adopted strategy. The previous experience in the Pacific during World War II, where the United States faced jungle warfare, hidden enemies, and ambushes, proved less useful in Vietnam. While in the Pacific, the goals were clear and tangible, such as not yielding any islands, reclaiming territory, and expelling the Japanese. In Vietnam, the objectives tended to blur. The fighting unfolded in a confusing setting with no clear advancements, engaging in combat from village to village in the jungle. The search and destroy strategy led by General Westmoreland was complemented by the brutality of Operation Rolling Thunder, which extended from March 1965 until the Tet Offensive 3 years later. This operation constituted a large-scale ambush where the U.S. Air Force systematically bombed North Vietnam with B-52 napalm bombs, causing massive destruction and leaving a profound psychological impact on the civilian population. Although napalm proved useful for attritional warfare, destroying shelters, tunnels, and trenches hidden underground, as well as instilling fear in the population, Westmoreland's strategy was increasingly trapped in an exchange of corpses. The planned devastation in Vietnam aimed to demoralize the communists, both psychologically and physically. But paradoxically, it became unbearable in the United States, despite the disproportion in casualties between both sides. American democracy could not tolerate such a massacre. Protests were inevitable. On the other hand, Ho Chi Minh's regime spread the narrative that their nation was waging a national liberation war against a foreign invader. From Hanoi, the Vietnamese dictator coordinated actions between the Communist Army and the Viet Cong guerrillas, providing them with logistical support, supplies, new recruits, and weapons. Despite the U.S. Army winning most battles and driving out the guerrillas, they continued to replace their fighters and regain influence in rural areas. American troops found themselves increasingly trapped in an endless labyrinth. Despite overwhelming resource disparity, with the United States deploying advanced technology and formidable arsenals, the Viet Cong responded with deep knowledge of the terrain and cunning, lethal guerrilla tactics. In this challenging scenario, survival and cunning often overshadowed conventional armament superiority. On May 15, 1964, an American battalion-sized detachment fell victim to a devastating Viet Cong ambush. The consequences of the clash were catastrophic, with 60 U.S. troops confirmed dead, 65 wounded, and a staggering total of 135 missing. Casualties like these, in a single day, had not been seen even in the worst moments of World War II. The ambush took place approximately 45 miles southwest of Saigon, in the Mekong Delta province of Kien Hoa, an area increasingly infiltrated by insurgents. According to military intelligence, the guerrilla force involved in the ambush consisted of 2 battalions totaling 800 men. On the other hand, the exact size of the U.S. government squad was difficult to determine, with estimates ranging between 250 and 350 troops. It is worth noting that the American Army included elite units known as Rangers, in addition to regular infantry. These forces were tasked with assisting 2 other companies in pursuing attackers who had previously assaulted a nearby outpost. However, the American troops inadvertently fell into the trap, as recounted by one of the survivors.
The terrain was covered with immense, thick vegetation. And so they had an opportunity to hide until the last minute, which was why a favorite tactic of theirs was the ambush.
The ambush exposed a clear weakness in American counterinsurgency tactics, highlighting a critical gap in their ability to effectively respond to such situations. The Viet Cong had repeatedly used surprise attacks throughout the country with devastating effectiveness, leveraging elements of surprise, camouflage, and speed of attack to achieve success. Unlike frontal engagements where prior planning or air support could be utilized, ambushes offered few opportunities for U.S. forces to call in reinforcements or airstrikes. Just days later, on May 22, 1964, Bravo Company of the 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, departed from Yankee Station eastward along the southern edge of the trace. Their mission was to clear enemy troops east of Route 561. However, after advancing about 400 meters, they fell into an L-shaped ambush set by a unit of the Vietnamese Army. The ambush triggered a devastating barrage of machine gun fire, mortars, and grenades, causing numerous casualties within the first 20 minutes of the battle. Captain Harris, the leader of Bravo Company, died in the confrontation but was credited with maintaining order and discipline, which prevented even greater casualties. For 4 consecutive years, the war escalated, and although Vietnamese casualties multiplied, the American Army, due to the sudden ambushes, became increasingly weakened, physically, psychologically, and morally. By August 25, 1968, amid the monsoon season in Vietnam, a large resupply convoy consisting of 81 trucks from the 48th Transportation Group departed Long Binh, bound for the 1st Brigade, 25th Infantry Division, located near the Cambodian border. Despite adverse weather conditions and warnings of possible enemy attacks, the convoy set out. As they moved along the potholed roads, the trucks were divided into 3 series, with refrigerated vehicles at the front, followed by cargo, fuel, and ammunition vehicles at the rear. Normally, the journey would take a few hours, but the convoy moved at a limited speed of 20 miles per hour due to terrain conditions. The 1st and 3rd Brigades of the 25th Infantry Division typically provided security along the main supply route, but the 3rd Brigade had been diverted to Saigon on orders from the new division commander, Brigadier General Ellis W. Williamson. With only 8 armed military police vehicles to protect the convoy's 81 vehicles, the risk was high. At 11:45 a.m., the convoy passed through the quiet town of ANNIHIL4TE. a column of soldiers from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam marched on the north side of the road, next to the rubber plantation known as Little Rubber. However, these soldiers turned out to be members of the Viet Cong. Suddenly, the guerrillas opened fire. Elements of the North Vietnamese Army's 88th Regiment, who had infiltrated Little Rubber the previous night, also joined the attack. The ambush was intense and well coordinated. The convoy soldiers attempted to defend themselves, but the enemy outnumbered them and was well prepared. They fired rockets, machine guns, and automatic weapons at the vehicles, causing chaos and destruction. Some trucks were hit and began to burn, while others were trapped on the blocked road. Drivers and soldiers who managed to get out of their vehicles took defensive positions, using whatever they could find for cover. However, the situation was desperate. The ambush had been meticulously planned, and the enemy had exploited the lack of security and bad weather to launch a devastating attack. Communications were difficult, and air and artillery support were out of reach. The soldiers faced an unequal struggle as the enemy continued their relentless assault. Before the increase of American troops in the mid-1965 war, it was evident that territorial victory belonged to the guerrillas. However, as offensive operations intensified, the enemy could no longer operate under cover of darkness with impunity. During the night of June 18, 1967, 10 infantry soldiers from the U.S. 196th Light Infantry Brigade set up an ambush 16 kilometers south of Chu Lai in Quang Ngai Province as part of Task Force Oregon's efforts to secure the base complex of that strategic city. Led by 2nd Lieutenant Truman P. Sullivan and Sergeant Lloyd E. Jones, the squad prepared to surprise assault enemy terrorists operating in the area. The location was strategically chosen near two villages, Phuoc 1 and Phuoc 2, where local Viet Cong had been causing terror. The squad, under Sergeant Jones's leadership, was well equipped and prepared for the mission, carrying rifles, grenades, and other necessary equipment. Positioned in 4, the group established security forces on the east and right flanks, with Sergeant Nobles leading the latter. Command led by Jones oversaw the operation from the center. As night fell, the squad patiently awaited the enemy's approach. When 6 Viet Cong soldiers rushed into the trap, the Americans acted swiftly. Jones detonated a claymore mine, instantly eliminating 1 enemy Vietnamese. The squad then confronted the rest of the Viet Cong with gunfire and grenades. Despite sporadic fire, the elite team maintained control of the situation. With the mission accomplished and 2 soldiers wounded, Sergeant Jones ordered a retreat from the trap site to avoid possible guerrilla reinforcements. The squad returned to the base camp without further incidents, effectively countering the threat in the area. Since that last assault, the war continued its bloody course without major developments, except for the My Lai massacre on March 16, 1968. Despite the government and military's efforts to maintain public support and the narrative of a just and necessary war, reports of atrocities committed in My Lai undermined any argument in favor of military intervention in Vietnam. On this tragic day, American soldiers from the United States Army, under the command of Lieutenant William Calley Jr., entered the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province and perpetrated an indiscriminate massacre of civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. The operation was triggered under the mistaken belief that the village harbored Viet Cong members. However, the soldiers encountered no resistance and proceeded to massacre over 500 unarmed civilians. This act of atrocious brutality not only shocked the world, but also led many soldiers to confront deep ethical and moral dilemmas. the soldiers knew they were fighting a war without popular support.
And I understand that it was an unpopular war. But the guys that went there, even if they were drafted, boy, they fully believed in coming out of there alive. They fully believed in what they were doing. And yes, we were probably seeing on the other side of the political battle there, we had to believe that we could win that war.
Although some veterans may have maintained a more traditional view of heroism and duty during the conflict, for many others, the experience of My Lai and other similar atrocities shed light on the moral complexity of war. Ultimately, the withdrawal of American troops in 1973 and the fall of Saigon in 1975 marked the end of a long and costly offensive that left a legacy of suffering and division on both sides. Ambushes, with their ability to level the playing field between a conventional army and a guerrilla force, stood out as an effective tactic that challenged conventional combat strategies. Beyond their military impact, they represented the resistance of a determined people defending their land and independence. That concludes the video. If this report on the Vietnam War has intrigued you, we encourage you to subscribe to receive similar content in future editions of Military History.